Welcome back. As you may recall, during the events of the Return of the Jedi, Boba's jetpack is activated, unbeknownst to him, jettisoning him into the Sarlacc pit below. According to Star Wars, more specifically C-3PO, when referring to the Sarlacc, he says, "You will find a new definition of pain and suffering, as you're slowly digested over 1,000 years." So I think there's a few important questions to ask here, but first we have to revisit another specific scene in The Mandalorian Season 2. While on Tython, once Boba reveals himself to Din Djarin, the Mandalorian is surprised to find out that Fennec Shand is still alive, a bounty hunter he once thought dead, and who is now in league with Boba. Now here's where things start to take a turn into the Theoryverse. Fennec Shand elaborates in essence that she owes Boba Fett a life debt, due to the fact that he saved her from certain death. In other canon filmography, we see the mention of a life debt in Episode 1 of Phantom Menace. If you remember correctly, when Qui-Gon Jinn saves our old friend Jar Jar Binks, he brings it up later to Big Boss Nass in negotiations, and he gets Jar Jar out of an execution on the merit that Jar Jar owes him a life debt as well. So this begs a few questions, and this is where the main brunt of the theory lie. We sort of have to speculate on how Boba escapes the Sarlacc pit, and I'm sure this is going to be addressed in some capacity in the upcoming Boba show. However, I think it's safe to say that Boba does get some form of help somewhere in his escape, and I think it's also a given that he started the process of digestion into the Sarlacc. So one half of my theory thinks that maybe he's saved by someone and escapes a certain death, but there's a lot of different evidence in terms of why I think Boba owes a life debt as well. During the show The Mandalorian, we see a real shift where Boba goes from ruthless bounty hunter to honorable person. When looking back at Boba pre-Sarlacc and pre-Mandalorian, he was pretty ruthless, hunting bounties for the highest bidder, being jailed at a young age for a vengeful assassination attempt, and having a very selfish propensity to get himself in bad situations, but also to make sure that he's number one, and that he's the one who's always making out best out of everybody. Now we have to consider his attitude going into The Mandalorian. He's lost his armor, and maybe since he's lost his armor, he's forced to live without it, and he's forced to live without his identity. Maybe here he realizes himself beyond that of the armor, beyond that of bounty hunting. At the beginning of The Mandalorian Season 2, we see a very stoic Boba Fett wrapped in robes, watching the Mandalorian take his armor, and something in that moment must have triggered him to take the armor back. Now there's further evidence that some sort of major change has affected Boba. Besides saving Fennec Shand from death, which is something you really don't get out of a canon Boba Fett pre-Sarlacc, he also pledges to help the Mandalorian 2 save Grogu. And when you think about it, there's not much for Boba to gain in these scenarios. Right now, all of a sudden, he's noble to the Mandalorian, he decides to save Fennec Shand, and of all these times he decides to keep these pledges and promises now, something in my mind has to give. And it starts with a life debt possibly owed. We can speculate on who exactly the debt may be owed to. Is it owed to the Jawas? Which would be pretty funny seeing Boba Fett have to tolerate the silly little Jawas and their egg obsession. Or does he owe it to the Tusken Raiders? Maybe he doesn't owe anyone anything, and maybe he's just simply changed because of the second lease on life to refocus as he essentially is exiled on Tatooine. And again, we have to revisit that point before. He's essentially naked. When have we seen Boba without his armor beyond that of childhood? It's a given the armor was removed, and perhaps there's a major revelation that happens to him during that time. Now obviously he's still skilled at brutally killing people, and maybe even more brutal than before. However, these changes I mentioned before in terms of his shift in attitude and nobleness, they're obvious, and they're made and relayed to the audience for a reason. In my personal estimation, I think Boba might owe a life debt to the Sand People. By simply looking at the garb he's wearing in The Mandalorian when he's watching Mando take his armor, you see similarities in terms of the wear. And there's another clue here too. When looking at the weapon of choice that Boba uses, he's actually using a Gothy stick, which is a weapon of choice amongst the Tusken Raiders. As noted by Wikipedia, the Gothy stick was a traditional melee weapon of the Tusken Raiders of Tatooine, and generally speaking in Star Wars, things aren't just coincidence. So what do you think? Do you think Boba is in fact in life debt to someone? Personally, I think there may be a debt, but it's also very possible that his time in solitude in Tatooine truly changed his worldview. However, at the end of the day, he still is Boba Fett, and he still does have that bounty hunter instinct, albeit with a major shift in his personality. But anyway, I'm honestly really curious to see what you guys think about this. Definitely let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for your viewership and support. If you want to interact with me, definitely hit me up on Twitter or comment below where I'm always active. Don't forget to like this video, share, comment, and subscribe. And remember, the Force is with you, always.